Welcome, and thanks for tuning in to this episode segment that we're doing on creative application of perennial forage plantings. My name is Jared Knock. I live here in Eastern South Dakota Farm and Ranch here. Work at AgSpire as VP of Agriculture Innovation. And we're going to be talking about creative application of perennial forage plantings. And specifically, we have another segment coming out for those in more of our Western geographies. But I'm going to be speaking to primarily species and applications generally for those living east of the 100th meridian. So if you're in the Dakotas, that's generally east of the Missouri River, eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, into Iowa, Minnesota, northern Missouri, and farther east. So if you're in one of those geographies, the types of applications and the species are going to fit primarily to you. Then stay tuned for another episode that's coming out shortly here that'll be more applicable to the Western geographies. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about who AgSpire is, for those of us that are maybe just learning about us. We're going to talk about different types of these perennial seedings, whether there's a general alfalfa seeding, it's a hayland planting, improved pasture, or if you've got existing pastures or hay fields, how we can diversify those through the interseeding of legumes or grasses into those. AgSpire focuses on real progress through regenerative agriculture. We were founded about 3.5 years ago with a vision to say not only can we help to apply new regenerative techniques on our farms and ranches, but as well as how do we connect those with the supply chain? How do we connect those with the companies that are ultimately buying our commodities and turning them into food and biofuel products at a broader scale? By participating in our programs, we not only offer voluntary incentives as well as technical assistance and guidance for implementation, but we also focus on making sure that those count. Beyond just telling our story, how do we get data-driven solutions for our customers so that they can reassure consumers and ultimately buyers of our commodities that we are making tremendous strides in the area of regenerative agriculture within the supply chain, whether it be beef or corn, oats, soybeans, pork, and etc. Obviously, today we're mostly talking about beef production as forage, but also can cross over into dairy production, sheep production, as well as other small and large ruminants. All right, so initially we're talking about a general alfalfa seeding. So this is the uncreative approach to seeding and perennial, and this is primarily what most of us have been doing, whether they're beef or dairy producers, for a very long time. We plant 100% alfalfa, anywhere from 15 to 25 pounds an acre, use that for hay. We all pretty much know the benefits of alfalfa, but it's a very robust, high protein, high yielding solution. But it does have some disadvantages. For example, it does leave a lot of bare ground for the most part. It does have very high persistence of either winter kill or flooding kill. So if we have any ponded low areas, we'll see the alfalfa die out and then lose access to producing any forage in those spots. It is a shorter lived perennial, so we usually need to refresh those stands somewhere between every 4 to 8 years, depending on your geography. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what those creative applications look like. For the last quite a few years on our farm and ranch, and for many of those people that we've helped with perennial hay seedings, we've been including grasses into the mixture. And if you ask yourself why, we look at that as a symbiotic relationship between what grasses can do and what legumes can do. Legumes are enormously effective at fixing their own nitrogen. It's their superpower, right? So we rarely have to put nitrogen applications on legumes because it's one of the only natural pathways, in fact, the main natural pathway to fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is the number one highest component of our atmosphere. However, it's in a covalent bond, which makes it very inaccessible to plants, even though that's the number one limiting factor for plant growth. Legumes create a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that exist on their roots and form nodules that can feed that plant its nitrogen coming out of the air. It's kind of a miracle of creation that this symbiotic relationship exists. But what normally happens is that the ability to fix nitrogen in a legume exceeds what that legume can fully carry. Grasses are very nitrogen dependent, meaning they can't fix their own nitrogen. And if you have a pure grass planting of hay, you'll have to continually apply nitrogen source to that to refresh it and keep it at its max potential. By planting them in roughly a 50-50 mixture, and that can be adjusted to 80% legumes, 20% grasses, or vice versa. We're taking advantage of that natural symbiotic relationship where the nitrogen fixed from the alfalfa or the other legumes, clovers, etc., are feeding that grass growth throughout. And so we have the ability to take advantage of both. One of the biggest advantages of including grasses in there is soil health, right? So if you've ever cut fresh alfalfa, either a new or existing seeding, you notice as soon as the alfalfa comes off, you look at that and say, "Man, this land is really bare," right? There's lots of space in between the population of where the alfalfa is growing, and you'll kick up a lot of dirt, right, when you're raking or when you're trying to bale that alfalfa hay. By planting the grass in there, you get a lot closer to a sod like formation. So you reduce a lot of water runoff, you increase infiltration. And then again, if you have any low, poorly drained areas in those fields, including the grasses that you want in there from the get go, those will allow that forage production to continue, even if your alfalfa does have a winter kill event or if it does have a ponding issue in the field. I like to think of the grass alfalfa plantings as a kind of an insurance mechanism as well. Uh, Long-term alfalfa stands will tend to get grasses growing in them. If you've ever left a stand go for more than 5 or 6 years, you start to get grasses coming in. So you can tell the soil is actually kind of asking for that symbiotic relationship, or it's asking for someone to fill that void. Monocultures, while very common in annual cropping production, are rarely found in nature, right? In nature, natural systems, you almost always find this relationship between broadleafs and grasses growing together. If you look at healthy native grasslands or healthy improved grasslands, they generally strive for that over time. My thinking is that you should plant the grasses that you want in your alfalfa seedings so that you don't end up with the grasses that you don't want, because eventually you're going to end up with yellow foxtail, you're going to end up with barnyard grass, June grass, Kentucky bluegrass, brome grass, smooth brome grass, if you don't put something in there. We found that the length of the stand is significantly improved by adding some of these improved grasses, and grasses are better than they have been. So there's ongoing improvement in grass seed breeding over time. And so now we've got not just orchard grass, but we've got premium late maturing orchard grass, HLR orchard grass, coming out of companies that have global breeding systems. And so we're not just limited to the grasses that we're used to that maybe are existing in our road ditches or stands that were planted 30 or 40 years ago. The grasses that we have today are much, much improved. This is an example of a stock mix, which is available through Renovo Seeds and Millborn Seeds online. And we're using a top end bred alfalfa with late maturing orchard grass and tall forage fescue. So tall forage fescue, STF 43, is a wonderfully productive plant. And for those of us in a northern climate, right north of I-80, and you're saying, I've never planted fescue, we're too far north of that, STF 43 has tremendous mobility into North Dakota and even has quite a bit of uptake in Alberta and Canada. So STF 43 as a tall forage fescue is extremely adept to this environment and is really it's still a cool season grass, but because it's got so much tolerance for southern climates, it is moderately productive to very productive, even in our mid of summer as we look at getting into the north. These two grasses complement alfalfa extremely well, and you're going to have all those benefits I talked about. If you have a drown out area where the alfalfa is not coming, you're going to still have grasses coming in there. You're going to have sod formation, and they really will compete in a 3 or even 4 cutting environment. For the summer, you're going to see grasses prevalent throughout there. It'd be the most common in your first cutting, but it's going to be coming throughout there the entire time. I'm going to show you just a little example of some areas where I used it at. So I like to think of the creativity, not just in the species that we're using, but also the where and the how. So looking at this slide, I'm showing you a picture back from 2021, fall of 2021, where we would have planted what was an existing corn soybean field, which had traditional tillage done. And as you can see in the left hand of the screen there, I've got all kinds of issues in this field. I've got some saline issues, which if you're from the Dakotas, you're well aware of, and you can see that elsewhere. So I'm starting to lose productivity from salt buildup. I've got compaction areas on the end rows where we're constantly turning around and not getting anything to grow. I've got some ponding issues on the right side of that figure you're looking at what is kind of a natural waterway or drainage area where I'm losing crop almost every year, every time we get an excess rain. And I've also got my driveway, right? This is my house. And so, right by that driveway there, I've got a management area that I'm actually looking at for a lot of reasons. I'm looking at a greenscape that I drive down multiple times every day. It's where the school bus comes to pick up my kids. Um, and also, I've got a little bit of management when it comes to winter weather, and I can put snow strips. When I do my last cutting, I can kind of control the amount of snow that I'm going to have to push if I manage that buffer area a little bit different. So in this situation, I'm looking at what we would have multiple terms to describe a creative area of planting. I've got essentially a grass waterway. I've got a low ponding issue. I've got a compaction issue on the end rows. I've got saline areas to address, and I've also got a management area around a driveway to control snow. I've also, if you look at on the right hand side picture towards the trees, many of us in crop production will talk about tree effect, right? The first round or two that we have next to trees, lower performance due to the ability of those trees to manage to draw on subsoil moisture. They will sometimes shade and leave those crops in shade, which will reduce sunlight. I've also planted that along the trees to avoid the tree effect. What you're looking at here is essentially about a 40-acre piece, and I planted it back to about 50-50 perennial vegetation and crop production. So in the middle, I'm taking the better part of the field, the part that I still want to have an annual crop production, and I'm just saying I'm going to manage the acres that I want in forage production around that. I've reduced and eliminated end rows in this situation, so I don't have any end rows around this field. I turn up and down. I mapped it out to be exactly in 16 row units, so it matches up with the corn planter or the strip till rig when I do it. And eventually, of increased productivity, I would estimate by about 30% within that field by taking the marginal areas and planting that perennial forage. The last couple of years that I've done this, when I do the math, I've actually outgrossed the value of my field with the perennial field border around the field. So been averaging 5 to 7 tons of hay per acre, quality alfalfa grass, high protein hay. And that's actually in these kind of lower commodity price years exceeded the gross value of my corn soybean production that I've done within the field. In addition to hay planting, there's a lot of opportunity for improved pasture. Now, I'm a big fan of native grasses. We've done a lot of native grass restoration on our properties over the years, but I really do understand and appreciate the value of using an improved grass mixture. So our native grasses would be the iconic C4 warm season grasses, big blue stem Indian grass, switchgrass, side oats grama, blue grama, things of that nature. I also know that those are multi-year commitments to get those native grasses established. If you're looking for a shorter turnaround and looking at something you're not so much worried about drought resilience and midsummer grazing and looking at early green up, improved species are really a big advantage over that. So I'm going to look at what is called the corner post seed mixture from Renovo and Millborn Seeds. So this has got not only the STF43 forage fescue and orchard grass, but I've also got improved premium timothy, some perennial ryegrass, meadow fescue, meadow brome, and then as well as a spattering of clovers and legumes. So I have Alsike Ladino, a medium red clover. Also, you could put some grazing safe falcata yellow flower alfalfa, and that will come into play, especially the farther west you go. It's got extreme drought tolerance. It's a non-bloating alfalfa, and just to kind of create that same symbiotic relationship as we were talking about in the hay fields into the pastures as well. This is an example of a seed mix that you can plant early in the spring and expect productivity out of it in year one. Whereas if it was a native grass seeding, I'm looking at at least a 1 to 2 year management process of getting that native grass up to speed. They are all cool season grasses, so that is something to think about. If you're doing a pasture seeding right next to an existing native grass stand, the idea would be is that if you can control rotation to where you start and end on your cool season grass mixes while letting your warm season grasses somewhat stockpile and waiting till the middle of June, et cetera, to get on those, that's really kind of an ideal way to do it. And I've even helped people with larger seedings with multiple paddocks to create that mix of saying, I'm going to do a couple of improved seeded pastures, and I'm going to do it right next to a couple of native grass pastures. And then I can watch and monitor those and graze those accordingly over time. Even so, stockpiling cool season grasses is not a bad strategy. In this part of the world, our existing introduced grasses are primarily brome grass. These grasses have a much broader window of productivity than smooth brome grass, which essentially comes almost completely dormant from in the months of July and August, and then kind of comes back with a fall regrowth in September. Uh, these species are going to have more productivity in the middle of summer than what we're probably used to with Kentucky bluegrass and brome grass for existing pastures. Interseeding legumes into pastures. This is something to say I've already got a pasture. Maybe over the years, I didn't have much for positive broadleafs in there, so I've had to fight back some weed problems. Again, nature abhors a vacuum, so if you don't plant the broadleaves that you like, you'll end up with the broadleaves that you get. So by doing an effective control strategy on your broadleaves and then coming into adding the broadleaves that you want, you'll likely stave off future um, invasive species issues, whether that's leafy spurge or thistle, or even excess amounts of curly cup gumweed or goldenrod. Median red clover is a wonderfully robust. It's technically a biennial. It's most of the time classified as a short-lived perennial, but it does a great job of seeding itself down. I've seen areas where it's been included from 15 to 20 years ago, where it's still fairly persistent in a positive way. It'll never take over the grasses, but it'll do really well coming up in there. Red clover is probably the easiest thing to establish into dense stands of sod-forming grasses like smooth brome grass, Kentucky bluegrass, June grass. Sandfoin is something that we'd kind of run into probably in the western fringes. So if you're west of the South Dakota border, into South Dakota, into eastern Nebraska, eastern North Dakota, Sandfoin moves to the west really well, as does Falcata alfalfa. Sandfoin is kind of a one cutting legume if you use it as a straight up forage, but it works really well as an inclusion into a pasture mix. It's a non bloating variety. It doesn't have as much persistence. I've heard some scary stories about Sicer milk vetch and things like that that really will take over a pasture and field and like choke out the grasses. The species that we're looking at won't have a propensity to do that. Falcata alfalfa is an ever blooming alfalfa, which means that it doesn't, most alfalfas, if you don't cut them, they'll go through a bloom period, they'll automatically go to seed. Falcata alfalfa is actually quite expensive because it's hard to get seed production from it because it just keeps blooming over time. So you won't have it go into dormancy or kind of get rank if you're not grazing it right away. Once it's included in a pasture, it'll keep putting on new yellow blossoms and keep having that pollinating period throughout the entire summer. It's not as aggressive as regular alfalfa, and it has lower bloating risk as well. Grasses into alfalfa, and that really could be any legume, assuming that a full stand of alfalfa is the most common. If you let the alfalfa stand go for 4 or 5 years, again, you'll start to get encroachment on things that'll take advantage of that gap as that alfalfa regresses. Sometimes folks will say, I've got an alfalfa stand. I really don't want to start over with it. I like what's out there, but it's starting to get thin. It's trickier. Grasses into alfalfa, grasses into legume is a much trickier proposition than legumes into grasses, but it can be done. So if you look at Timothy, orchard grass, again, looking at those improved varieties, robust, high in forage value and quantity. Smooth brome is something that you'd introduce with a management consideration in mind, right? So if you introduce smooth brome into your alfalfa fields, it will turn into smooth brome with some alfalfa over time. But if you have an area that's really sensitive, maybe it's got ponding issues, maybe it's got it takes a lot of runoff water, it could have some other saline considerations. Introducing smooth brome is an okay thing to do. It will get very invasive. It will take over time. But if you're looking at an area where that's okay, then it's a good fit. If you're looking at something where you can maintain these other improved grasses, I would do that instead. Meadow brome is my favorite alternative to smooth brome. It is usually about 4 to 6 inches higher in height. It'll have about a half a ton per acre advantage in forage yield over time than smooth brome will. it is not as early maturing, so it's a little bit later maturing, meaning it doesn't go into dormancy quite as fast, and it's not invasive, which means that you can get it established and you don't have to worry about it spreading throughout the property or getting to where it takes over time. And perennial ryegrass, especially as you move into the southern part of the region that we're talking about, is also a fantastic improved variety. And remember, perennial ryegrass is a very similar component to what you put into your lawn seed. So if you're looking at a calving pasture or a high traffic area or something that does get a lot of pressure over time, that can handle being kind of grazed really short from time to time, as long as it has a recovery period, as being a value component to that mix. That's some of the basics of creative perennial forage planting in the different ways. Remember, we talked about not only the general alfalfa seeding that we're all used to, but how to do that in a more robust and resilient way with the inclusion of improved grasses. We talked about how to create a tame or introduced pasture mix and the value of that versus native grasses. We looked at interseeding both grasses into legumes, the trickier way to do it, and also the more common way to do that, which is to introduce legumes into grass mixtures that maybe lack diversity. If you want to learn more, please visit our website. You can email myself at the link here. You can give us a call, and we can chat more about that. We have programs available. So we have a couple different programs in that geography in the states that I mentioned where we do offer cost share and incentives. So make sure to ask about that when you're thinking through this. Those can be just kind of cost share for these types of seedings, no matter how they're used. One of our programs, Grass is Greener, is eligible in up to 18 states in the Northern Plains and Midwest if you're interested in that. We also have some other programs that might be applicable as well. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please email me with questions or visit our website to learn more. Thank you very much.